Hi, I'm Max Keiser. This is the Keiser Report. Yeah, you can follow me on Twitter at Max Keiser. Do it now. Stacy.
Right. Well, Max, you know that we've been having this money printing until morale improves and the wealth gap exploding. So I have these two headlines at the top of this episode to highlight the, let's say, the problem with it, especially with the power. Both political parties seem to love the Cantillon effect because the elite always benefited from it. But we'll look at the prescription of higher taxes and how this is, you could stop the cause in the beginning rather than have to wait to, tax and use force against people. So the wealthiest 10% of Americans own a record 89% of all U.S. stocks. So we've been printing unprecedented amounts of money, especially in the last 18 months. And it was all done in the name of, just like we invaded Afghanistan to help the women and children, Iraq to help the women and children, Benghazi to help the women and children, Yemen to help the women and children. Here it was to help the poor working class people who were forced to work from home or not go into jobs during the pandemic. Well, during that time of all that money printing, the top 1% gained more than $6.5 trillion in corporate equities and mutual fund wealth during the COVID-19 pandemic, while the bottom 90% added just $1.2 trillion. According to the latest data from the Federal Reserve, the share of corporate equities and mutual funds owned by the top 10% reached the record high in the second quarter, while the bottom 90% of Americans held about 11% of individually held stocks, which was down from 12% before the pandemic.
Right. In a meritocracy, if you bring something useful into the world, you can make a lot of money, like Thomas Edison or other entrepreneurs. So when you see this statistic that 90% of the wealth is held by 10% of the population, and they added trillions of dollars to their net worth since the pandemic, one would look out onto the American landscape and look at all the wonderful innovation these folks have brought people to their lives. Oh, wait, hold on. Life expectancy is down. Infant mortality is up. Wealth and income gap is widening. The Gini coefficient looks terrible. Deaths of despair are exploding. So I think it's natural to conclude that all this money printing is not feeding a meritocracy. In fact, it's feeding a kakistocracy. Rule by the least qualified, rule by the malevolent in society, have gamed the system to give themselves a huge raise at the expense of everyone else. So don't tell me this because, they're so bright, young, and shiny that they deserve all this money. No, they stole it.
So your guest in the second half, Charles Hugh Smith, does call it a kleptocracy. And yeah, I guess you could have seen it for over the last few administrations. The president himself has always pointed out the stock market. Whatever the stock market is doing, it tells you how I'm doing. And that filters down to the political pie being fiercely fought over. So they all focus on the stock market. So that's the number, that's all they care about, the number go up. So that is the cause of the data here, according to the Fed. The stock market, which has nearly doubled since the March 2020 drop and is up nearly 40% since January of 2020, was the main source of wealth creation in America during the pandemic, as well as the main driver of inequality. The total wealth of the top 1% now tops 32%, a record, according to Fed data. Nearly 70% of their wealth gains over the past year and a half, one of the fastest wealth booms in recent history, came from stocks. So that's how, the likes of Elon Musk is worth $250 billion on paper. Before it, he was worth like $40 billion. Before the pandemic, $50 billion. So that's why the stock gains, the money printing goes into the stock gains, which goes into further policy, which goes into the pockets of all these Fed, executives, chairmen, presidents, all of these politicians like Nancy Pelosi raking it in on the consequences of their own policies, further invites more of those same policies of the money printing to cause these huge gaps up in the stock prices.
Right. I remember back in the 1980s when I was on Wall Street, we had the big scandals like Mike Milken. We had a movie called Wall Street, which was about insider trading and the tragedy that this was, directed by Oliver Stone. Today in 2021, we have actively senators, central bankers, Congress people, all trading on inside information to an extent much greater than what was depicted in the movie Wall Street in the 1980s. They've turned essentially their sole purpose in Washington, D.C., if you're Nancy Pelosi, is to front run the bills she's overlooking to profit in her personal account. That's how a civil servant got to make, close to $100 million by trading on inside information, which last I checked was illegal. So this is a dire circumstance. And when she goes and walks through the piles of human excrement on the street to tell her constituents what a great job she's doing, they're too smacked up on drugs to know what the heck she's saying, so they don't notice.
Okay, so these politicians, their stock portfolios are making them, multimillionaires, 100 millionaires. They're earning a huge amount on it. They could say it's the Fed causing this with the money printing and the quantitative easing. The Fed themselves have introduced a new policy that any of their, anybody on the policy committee, any of the Fed presidents, none of these people can own any individual shares. I guess they could own an ETF or a tracker of the S&P 500 or something like that, an index fund. So rather than target that, because look at the incentive structure. Remember, you have to look at the whole incentive structure of that's what checks and balances are all about. That's what a republic is all about. That's what why you have rules and regulations. So are they going to look at the money printing, at their stimulus checks, at all the money they're printing and say, oh, we need to stop that when they're getting so rich from it? No, this is what they're going to do and who they're targeting. These are the hidden ways America's billionaires pass wealth to their heirs tax-free. And that's Phil Knight of Nike, as some people say over in Europe wrongly. The past decade of record low interest rates, rising asset prices, and ever looser tax rules has made this an historically ideal time for the top 0.1% to pass wealth to their heirs. These trends have turned once minor loopholes in the tax code into gaping flaws. They cover the fact that Nike has gone from a market cap of 25 billion 12 years ago, i.e. 2009, in the beginning of the money printing, the epic money printing, to 250 billion now. And now they want to chase them with taxes. It's like, well, maybe don't print all that money and give it to those closest to the Fed. This is the cantillionaire effect right here. Stop the cantillionaire effect, and you won't have to sit there and waste all our time passing all these legislation, increasing taxes, which will never get paid by the likes of Phil Knight. He's got $250 billion. You think he's going to pay taxes? No, it's going to be somebody with $2 million.
Plus, as the article indicates, everyone agrees it's a loophole. So closing the loophole shouldn't take more than 1 or 2 days of debate in Congress. Instead, they're spending weeks and weeks talking about raising the corporate tax from 21% to 28%. And when they could just leave the corporate tax where it is and close that loophole, and it would have the same impact. And the story is about how he's passing the wealth on to his heirs without encumbering a tax burden as well. And I think that's an important point to consider, is that when they say that, well, the wealthy pay the majority of taxes in America. Let's be clear about something. This is only on reported income. Okay, let me be clear about this. That if we were to study the $20 to $25 trillion worth of untaxed capital floating around the world, thanks to the big four accounting firms or the gimmicks used by these guys like Phil Knight to avoid inheritance tax, et cetera, what you end up with is a minuscule amount of their wealth and income is actually reported. And yes, unreported income is the majority still of the total tax pie. But think for a second if, in fact, they had to pay taxes on all income, including unreported income. Instead of $3 trillion collected in taxes last year in America, it would be closer to $10 trillion. Smoke on that, Nancy Pelosi.
Well, the thing is, right there in front of you, we just covered it. $6.5 trillion. $6.5 trillion went to the top 1% in stock market gains. 1.2 trillion is a much smaller number than 6.5 trillion. 1.2 trillion went to the bottom 90%. So yes, obviously, they're going to have way more money to tax. Well, even if you just do a flat 10% tax, if you do a flat 5% tax or a 1% tax, that's it. Like, it would still be, they would pay more because all the gains go to them because of the Cantillon effect.
They're gifted trillions.
Yes.
And some of that is taxed.
Yeah.
And the volume of that taxation is greater than what's left given to the bottom portion that's given the less amount due to the Cantillon effect. That's true. And I'm just, I'm just saying that if they're in fact taxed on all reported income, it would be a much different situation.
They don't have much reported income.
No.
So here, Phil Knight went from 25 billion to 250 billion. That's an asset price increase. What does he do? He borrows against it. What did Donald Trump do? Borrow against it. They don't sell it. They don't realize any gains because then they would be taxed. So of course they're going to do that. Now, if there were a way to allow the ordinary Joe Bag of Donuts to do that, it would stop, right? Because that's what the Fed does, right? The Fed's policy is they don't want wages to rise because that's the inflation they're afraid of. They don't want the normal 90%. If those numbers were flipped, if the 6.5 trillion went to the 90% and the 1.2 trillion went to the top 1%, policy would change.
Right. And even as recently as 6 months ago, policymakers at the Fed and in Washington were telling you that because wages were not going up, due to the fact that they were artificially kept cheap and low, that in fact America was experiencing deflation. Mm-hmm. Okay, but now because of the Cantillon effect has reached its end game in terms of hiding the fact that this is just a transfer payment to the ultra wealthy, they're now saying it's inflation. Oh, it's transitory inflation. No, it's intractable inflation. Oh, we're in an inflationary spiral. And now wages are finally going up after if wages had reflected the true inflation numbers for the past 30 years, the minimum wage in America would be $65 an hour.
Right. Well, I think if they reduced income taxes to 0%, it would be a huge boom for the bottom 90%. They're the ones that actually pay most percentage of their actual income, working, going to a job, standing in line, doing stuff. They're the ones that would gain the most.
Right. It's not regressive. In fact, it's progressive. A 0% interest rate would be the most progressive thing any progressives could imagine by implementing a 0% interest rate.
You mean tax
rate.
Right, yeah.
And then also, at the very, very most, let's call it a 15% tax rate, would be the most progressive thing imaginable for America's working poor. Hey, we're going to take a break. When we come back, much more coming your way. Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Time now to turn to Charles Hugh Smith. The website is called of2minds.com. Welcome back, Charles.
Thank you, Max.
All right. Last episode, we were talking about deglobalization and supply chains. This episode, we're going to take a look at the imperial center amidst this entropic process collapsing the financial fabric. I didn't write that. Stacy wrote that. But nevertheless, Charles, we're talking about supply chain problems. The U.S., over the past 15 years, has increasingly turned to sanctions. That is to say, cutting off the supply of dollars and access to the global settlement layer. Biden just admitted, however, that Bitcoin has made this aggression impossible. Your thoughts?
Well, that's a great topic, Max, and I'm seeing more mainstream, corporate media coverage of the downside of trying to rely on the exorbitant privilege of the dollar as a way to pressure countries to do our bidding. And of course, cryptocurrencies, of course, we've discussed that in the past, and they're a seismic shift in the system of money. And of course, the system of money is the system of finance. And so the powers that be are of course, struggling with how to control crypto. And many of the people who are in the crypto world are attempting to figure out how to evade those controls. And so there's a real battle going on globally, which is playing out in real time.
Well, to be clear, when Bitcoin first came on the scene in 2009, it did so having successfully evaded any control by any outside influence, any outside force, any country. And it was born free in that respect, and it's unconfiscatable. And so what's happening on the sovereign level is that countries that have been victimized by America's act of war, that is to say, sanctions, are saying, you know what, we can actually bypass the dollar completely. And countries are divesting out of the dollar. So the dollar is at risk of being thrown overboard as world reserve currency. What implications does that have globally?
Well, that's a great question, Max. And I wrote a piece, I think it was probably 5 or 6 years ago, where I think it was based on one of our programs, where I discussed the idea of Bitcoin or another cryptocurrency becoming a reserve currency for specific countries. In other words, where countries could eventually choose to use cryptocurrencies as their reserve currencies, and instead of relying on fiat currencies, like accumulating yuan or dollars or euros. And of course, this would shake up the foundations of the global financial system, because you wouldn't be relying on currencies that can be manipulated by the issuer. In other words, the issuing central bank, right? And this would be a very positive development in my mind, because the core element we're trying to get here is competition, right? We're trying to get accountability, transparency, and competition within currency. So every individual and every nation can choose whatever currency they want, which works best for them. And that would create a much more stable and less manipulatable system.
Right. Well, probably the greatest colonial playground for America has been Latin America. And then we know from reading John Perkins' book, Confessions of an Economic Hitman, that usually involves encumbering these countries with enormous debts. And if they don't pay, we send in the CIA and the assassins. And that's not hyperbole, that's historically fact. One country has now stood up to the IMF and the CIA and the dollar, and that would be El Salvador. The President Bukele openly mocking the IMF on Twitter and essentially thumbing his nose at them. Doesn't this give us some hope, Charles?
Yes, it does. And in my, as you guys know, one of my little particular interests is within the cryptocurrency universe. I see a potential for a development in local cryptocurrencies. In other words, you can have global currencies like Ethereum and Bitcoin. But locally, I'd like to see a country like El Salvador pursue a labor-backed cryptocurrency. In other words, a local cryptocurrency that's issued for people actually doing useful work. And of course, that system, the idea here would be there's still developmental opportunities in the cryptocurrency space, and I think that what I'm looking for is a country like El Salvador to say, we can use cryptocurrencies across the entire spectrum, and where we need a local cryptocurrency to encourage local development and local wages, we're going to just generate that ourselves, or perhaps in a regional context.
Right. Well, if I can plug Bitcoin for a second, it does give access to a global currency, and the productivity in El Salvador is now set to go higher. GDP is set to go higher. And there is no lack of incentive now for the entrepreneurs of El Salvador to start working hard for Bitcoin, because they recognize Bitcoin has the decentralization necessary to maintain its purchasing power or to increase its purchasing power going forward. Anytime you step away from Bitcoin, you're entering into something that's more centralized or has variable like determining what would be quote unquote useful labor. And that means a degradation of its role as pure money. So it's already playing out in El Salvador, and they've already figured out that Bitcoin is really the answer. Now, it does end what you've described and what we've described, these Thucydides traps, fourth turning, Triffin dilemma, boom and bust. In other words, just sticking on Bitcoin for a second, it does take a lot of the cyclicality out of these economies, because you are removing the tendency to get, to, as they used to say at the central bank, remove the punch bowl when the party got too raucous. Well, the party never gets too raucous and the economy never gets too dead. It's just simply one unit of standard of account, and the economy ticks along nicely. Does that put an end to what you elegantly describe as the kleptocracy?
Well, it's certainly a part of it, Max. And just speaking about, just picking up that thread of Bitcoin and Latin America, I know personally that I paid two translators in Venezuela a few years ago in Bitcoin. And that Bitcoin is, from what I can gather, the informal national currency of Venezuela as well. So that my point here is that when countries go into economic crisis, Bitcoin serves as a foundation. In other words, you can always, if you can get that, then you have preserved some agency and some assets. And so that's another aspect to Bitcoin, is that when countries go into crisis, then it serves as the kind of go-to solution. Let's kind of try to tie this together to like relocalizing economies. Is that you need a stable currency that can't be undermined by a sovereign central bank, right? So that's the role that Bitcoin's offering, right? And so to that degree, if it encourages local development and localization, then it's going to be it's going to offer tremendous leverage.
Right. And we're seeing this play out in real time. And that contagion is spreading. I mean, in the 2008 crisis and the Lehman Brothers crisis, there was a financial contagion where the bad debts on Wall Street spread and triggered an avalanche of defaults around the world. And we responded by printing, in America anyway, close to $18 trillion, which is now, 12 years later, causing the inflation. When people say, why is gas now so high? Why is food prices so high? Well, it started 10, 11, 12 years ago when that money was printed. The oligarchs got to use it first for a decade, and they went from being multi-billionaires to being multi-hundred billionaires. And now it's trickling down 10 years later because of the Cantillon effect. And people are saying, oh my God, gas and food are so high, I can't afford them anymore. But that was a guaranteed outcome when you decide to inject 18 or 19 trillion dollars of funny money into the economy to bail out Wall Street. That's what happened in 2008. Pretty much things that you said and we said have played out exactly to script, Charles. And we know that as this crisis gets worse, the response from these folks will be to do exactly the same. They're going to keep printing, Charles.
Right. And as you said, it was easily predictable. And so now we're facing this sort of we're in a vice, because as you say, the value of the currency is declining. And so your purchasing power is dropping. But then meanwhile, there's global hoarding. In other words, like, what's the response of every enterprise and every household to like shortages? Well, you try to stock up on whenever that's available, then you get as much as you can. It's totally rational. Well, that of course exacerbates the scarcity cycle we're talking about. So another kind of danger here, or maybe that's not the right word, a threat, whatever, is of course the sovereign nations and central banks are trying to glom on to the cryptocurrency revolution by issuing their own digital currencies, right? And as if that's going to solve the problem. But of course, if you're going to print trillions in digital currencies, it's no different than printing trillions of yuan, yen, and euros, right? So it's like these are two crises which are linked, as you just described.
Right. In the 1930s, America experienced a deflationary depression. The purchasing power of the dollar actually went up, but there was not enough economic activity to support any meaningful GDP growth. As a matter of fact, it went into reverse. But this is actually something I don't think America has ever experienced, except maybe during the Revolutionary War and during the Civil War, and that is an inflationary depression. Your thoughts on that?
Well, that's a great topic, Max. And I have started calling all fiat currencies counterfeit currencies. And this is not unique to me. Other people use this term too, because in a way, economic activity generates value by creating a good or a service, right? And so if there's currency that's involved in that's actually legitimate. In other words, right, I've created a value and I've exchanged this value for a currency. But when you just create 18 trillion or 20 trillion or 36 trillion out of thin air and then give it to the oligarchs, that's counterfeit money. It actually wasn't associated with the creation of any value. And that's why this system is going to collapse. You can't just create currency that's unconnected to the creation of value and think that you're going to get away with that.
Well, Charles Hugh Smith, thanks so much for being on Keiser Report. And thanks again for last year sending us those lovely macadamia cookies, which we enjoyed directly from the island of Hawaii. Thanks for being on the show.
Thank you so much, Max. It's always my pleasure.
All right, and that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacy Herbert. I'd like to thank our guest, Charles Hugh Smith. The website is called of2minds.com. Until next time, bye, y'all.